Sokoneza kwa makina a intaneti kukonza maphunziro othandizira kukweza bizinesi za nyumba zofalitsa mauthenga.
Shall we welcome our first panel, a discussion between two individuals who have been working in a sustained manner to promote viability of the media, Professor Guy Berger and Zoe Titus, to take a deep dive into media viability and set the stage for today's deliberations.
Professor Guy Berger is the former director for freedom of expression and media development at UNESCO, where he spearheaded its global work on press freedom, safety of journalists, internet freedom, media pluralism and independence, gender and media, media and information literacy, and journalism education. Before that, Professor Berger headed up the School of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes University, Grahamstown, South Africa, from 1994 to 2010. Please give Professor Berger a warm round of applause. Zoe Titus is the director of the Namibia Media Trust and current chairperson of the Global Forum for Media Development, which is the biggest global community of media development and journalism support organizations. GFMD works collaboratively to sustain journalism as a public good. Zoe is a former regional director of the Media Institute of Southern Africa, MISA, and also chairs the African Platform on Access to Information. Please welcome Zoe Titus.
Guy, it's so wonderful to see you and have you back in Windhoek. The last time you were here was last year, around May, for World Press Freedom Day, at which time there was deep interrogation of the Windhoek Declaration, the 1991 Windhoek Declaration, and this very important conference ended with the Windhoek Plus 30 signing of an adoption of the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration. So Guy, maybe I'm pushing the boundaries here, but I'm going to say welcome to the capital of media freedom. Welcome back to Windhoek. Before we start, I'd like to ask the tech team to play a short video. If you can do that, this will situate our discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, on the 3rd of May 1991 in Namibia, journalists at a UNESCO seminar proclaimed the Windhoek Declaration. This became the benchmark for press freedom and media development. At last year's World Press Freedom Day, we saw new and additional challenges recognized by the Windhoek Plus 30 Declaration on information as a public good. The principles of Windhoek Plus 30 were later unanimously endorsed by UNESCO's 193 member states and address the following key challenges: media viability, greater transparency of internet companies, and the need to improve media and information literacy. The overarching challenge, however, is how to maintain the viability of media, because without it, there wouldn't be free and independent media to speak of. Independent press freedom without economically secure media would be an empty shell. This economic crisis for journalism, made starker by the financial impact of COVID-19, is severe. But in the face of this, comprehensive solutions are set out in the new UNESCO policy brief at the heart of the discussion today. The policy brief is supported by the International Programme for the Development of Communication, IPDC, which is leading UNESCO's contribution in the quest for sustainable journalism. The IPDC, which I have the honor to chair, is an intergovernmental initiative in the UN system. 39 UNESCO member states are elected to this body every 2 years with a mandate to promote media development in developing countries. Acting as a laboratory of ideas for emerging media policy issues, for the past 18 months, IPDC has been putting the viability issues on the international policy agenda. Extensive research has been undertaken. 3 examples. A report, Breaking News, produced by Economist Impact, commissioned by UNESCO. A special chapter in the World Trends in Freedom of Expression and Media Development Global Report 2021-2022. A handbook in 5 languages on inspiring practices at the media outlet level. 2 further activities have added to the momentum. A partnership with the World Association of News Publishers and IPDC-supported consultations and knowledge exchanges between media outlets in 10 countries, carried out by Free Press Unlimited. All these activities have fed into the policy brief, underlining that new support for journalism should never be at the expense of editorial independence or media pluralism. That means, for example, that public subsidies have to be distributed fairly and transparently. Our next steps are now to move forward through roundtables in order to convene stakeholders to discuss the policy recommendations at country level. In doing so, we would move from recommendations at global level to implementation at national level. Today, we have the data and a playbook of policy options on how exactly to go forward. Today, we can see opportunities to secure our current news media outlets. But our ambition should be higher, to expand the sector and to transform it to be more gender sensitive, more socially inclusive, and more professional. Let Montevideo be another milestone in the long walk to a free and sustainable press. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a short clip from this year's World Press Freedom Day celebrations in Montevideo. And I have the privilege of actually introducing Guy here, who in your previous life acted for quite some time as IPD secretary. So you were at the head of shaping a lot of these discussions and developing the knowledge around and associated research around many of these discussions. So Guy, the ambassador referred to a playbook that you have developed on possible activities, interventions to sustain media and to really move forward with this challenge of media viability. Can you give us some insight, please?
Well, good morning, Windhoek. Hello, Namibia, and hello, Malawi, and hello, Zimbabwe, and anybody else who's joining us here. Thank you, Zoe. I'm going to answer your question in a slightly indirect way, because I just want to say, since I was last here, 18 months ago, a lot has happened. This Windhoek Plus 30 declaration was then welcomed and endorsed by UNESCO and by the UN General Assembly. So this is big sticks in terms of what is the international view comes out of Namibia. For Namibia to keep its role from the first Windhoek Declaration, you had to be viable to keep that press freedom going. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had the Windhoek Plus 30. So congratulations on that. And then you yourself in Namibia, you've got the Access to Information Law, which is fantastic. Okay, it needs to be signed, needs to be implemented, as your director said from MICT. But this is real progress. So there's a lot of things that have been happening. I got retired from UNESCO, Some people say, are you tired? I said, not yet. But I am retired from UNESCO, and so I'm not living in Paris anymore. But I'm still taking forward some of that work, because the one thing that has not changed has been this viability story. And the big question that I think everybody has to ask, do we have the ability to do viability? Do we have the ability to do viability? Because it's not just something magic, it's not just something that will happen. And I'll go into some ideas, if you like, but I wanted to also just quote people here, the closing of the Windhoek +30 declaration, which I think is quite a ringing thing. So it says, Windhoek +30 declaration pays tribute to those who opened up this path. And Gwen Lister, of course, has been mentioned. Thank you, Gwen, for helping to open the path. So this new declaration paid tribute. It says, let each of us resolve to do our part to help secure information as a public good, as an urgent need today, and as a legacy for those who will come later. It says we express appreciation to the government and people of Namibia for hosting the conference for this World Press Freedom Day and the Windhoek +30. It says, your generosity has opened the road to take forward information as a public good. And it says it's now time for the generation of 2021, because that's when Windhoek +30 was done. Time for the generation of 2021 to make its contribution. So I'm sure that is everybody here. And so this viability thing, as has been said by Mr. Frans Ngitshila and the ambassador to Sweden, who's the chair of the IPDC, and in the introduction, Peter, by Zoe, this viability thing, it is the #1 challenge, because there's no point in training journalists to do investigations into, corruption in mining leases, or training journalists about data, or training journalists about climate change, if there are no journalists, or if the newsrooms are under such pressure that they haven't employed a new person in years, or they've kind of got rid of the older, more experienced journalists, and they just have young people who are still learning. So all these things, it's existential that you've got to have a viable media. And it's very nice to have small-scale commentators, individuals blogging, tweeting, TikToking. Super. But you also need some institutions, because institutions are like what give the power of joint action. Institutions are what can have some quality control, some ethics, some standards, some leadership, and sustainability. But institutions have got to pay their bills. Even individuals got to pay their bills, of course, but institutions, they have more costs than they have to pay their bills. So this is the big challenge, and this is what UNESCO was looking at, because they used to only look at press freedom, but press freedom is a bit meaningless if you don't have a strong media. So Zoe, I think you've chosen with your partners this theme now today. Like, what do we do, and particularly with journalism education? What's the playbook for journalism education, given this media viability crisis? And Mr. Frans Ngitshila said the industrial model of journalism has been something that we've lived with. It's still there. We have strong media institutions in a place like Namibia, but they're under a lot of stress. And it's not enough. I mean, Namibia, how many people have got media that suits their languages, where they live, their interests? Not everybody. I mean, it's mainly urban, it's mainly in dominant languages, it's mainly for an adult, politically interested audience. That's not enough to take Namibia, or you can replicate this in Zimbabwe, in Malawi. It's not enough, the existing media, we need more media. And so this is, I think, where journalism education has to suddenly start saying, we can't just keep on doing business as usual.
Yeah.
You agree?
I agree, for sure.
But what to do then? That's the
Yeah,
question.
that is a question, and I don't think anyone has a straightforward answer. I know that there are particularly media managers, those in the leadership in media institutions who really want the practical, give me a guidebook in terms of what to do, in terms of the technology that must be employed, in terms of the skills that are required. But I want to take you to another issue. This, a lot has been done, as you say, since 2021 in this space around media viability. So I want to quote the UNESCO Assistant Director General, Tawfik Jalassi, who says, and I quote, "The time is now for governments to set up national task forces to address these issues of viability, always having as a starting point the international standards on freedom of expression." You've written about that. A lot of your work is related to that. I know Prof. Franz Kruger has also written extensively about that. I also know that you've been quite involved in a process in South Africa to develop a mechanism to support independent media. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, this is not a new scenario in South Africa. South Africa is one of the few countries that has another mechanism, the MDDA, Media Development and Diversity Agency. So there is a history and a tradition of supporting independent media, or in that instance, community media.
Mm-hmm.
So would you please share what you have been doing, I think, along with SANEF in this instance to support or promote media viability?
Sure. Well, as you said, one of the recommendations of UNESCO is to develop more dialogue and more discussion exactly like this, and even task teams that can look into this, because this was one of the things that happened even 3-4 years ago in the UK. They created a national task team. They called it the Ken Cross Commission, and they came with some recommendations. And they recommended that in the UK, that there should be like an arts council, but the media council, that gives some money to media, especially small town media, because it was collapsing there. And the government welcomed this commission, but didn't do anything about that recommendation. But quite a lot of other things began to happen there, where at least stakeholders got together. They started promoting more innovation, because you can't just look for outside money to the media. You also have to transform the media. And so what does that mean to transform the media? How can you get subscriptions? How can you develop other business angles to pay the bills and so on? So anyway, in South Africa, the media there has really been suffering, basically because advertising has gone to social media. So in South Africa, about half the population use Facebook. And if you go on Facebook, you'll see a lot of advertising there. And that advertising used to go and support news, but it doesn't support the news anymore, although there is some news on Facebook. And so some of the publishers in South Africa are trying to do what happened in Australia. You basically get the support of government to like the wind behind your sails, and you go and you negotiate with the tech companies. You say, we need some of this money because you are carrying our content. We pay for it. You don't pay for it. You make money on it, and you must give us some money. So that's one thing the Competition Commission is looking at in South Africa. It's part of the solution. How can you get some of the transfer of resource back to media? But bear in mind that this thing happened in Australia quite successfully about 3 years ago. But since then, Facebook has collapsed in terms of its share price. Mark Zuckerberg has decided he wants to spend money in the metaverse, this kind of 3D stuff, which really is not going to be a big uptake here in Africa, I don't think, because of the technology and the bandwidth and so on. And then, as you know, Twitter is being run into the ground by a guy who came from the same country as me. The bird has landed, or the bird is dying, the bird is being killed. So that's Twitter there. TikTok, as you know, is growing worldwide. And TikTok, the question is, how much, let me ask a question here. Can you put up your hands if you use TikTok? Okay, not so many. Okay, can you put up your hands if you use TikTok twice a week? Okay, more, okay. Can you put up your hands if you use TikTok for news? Okay, a few people. Okay, can you give me a guess how much of the content on TikTok is news? What percent? 10%, 20%? What do you think? 10. You know, to be honest, I don't know, but I think it's probably far, far less because there's so much other content, some of which is fun and some of it is educational and some of it is informative. But news, it's like a tiny little thing because for TikTok, you also have to have a particular catchy format. You know, it must be short, should be visual, should have some action, some personality. And a lot of news production isn't in that space. I mean, you know, journalists are not accustomed to being fun, unfortunately. But anyway, so you know, you've got TikTok that's getting traction and getting advertising and not even having the kind of news quotient that Facebook would have or that Twitter would have. So this is a problem for society because people cannot live on entertainment alone. I wish we could, but we also need some information and about information about what's happening, you know, whether it's access to information bill, whether it's COVID and so on. Anyway, so in South Africa, they face this problem that the news media is losing money big time. And so the South African National Editors Forum, which is the counterpart of your Namibian National Editors Forum.
Editors Forum of Namibia.
Yeah, Editors Forum of Namibia. They, the South African National Editors Forum has been looking, can they try and get a fund? And now there's a big question, like a fund to do what and a fund controlled by who? This is a forum of editors. Should a forum become like a development agency? That's a debate they're having. Should they just try and get money for their own activities to support SANEF activities, campaigns, awareness raising? Because basically you're not going to get banks to put money into media or government funds for SME to support new startups or digital transformation of existing. You're not going to do it unless you have public opinion. You need a climate that's positive. It's part of the environment about making this viability. So I come back to the question, do we have the ability to make viability? So SANEF is looking, if they have a fund, can the fund increase the ability to support viability? And is it going to be direct, indirect? Is it going to be open for grants, or will they use it for their own awareness about how important journalism is? Can be fun journalism, can be boring journalism, but it should be journalism. And so SANEF are doing this, looking into this, and basically they want to get 100 million rand and then take 5 million rand a year off that to help support this viability issue. So to get 100 million is not so easy, but there are some tycoons in South Africa, and there's some foundations, so they'll push ahead. But quite what form this will take, I don't know. But that's good. There's that kind of initiative there to do that with the editors. As I say, the publishers are trying to get support of the Competition Commission. Journalism educators, what are they doing? What do you think journalism educators should do?
We will deal with that a little later. Jess, are you around? Could you hand a mic to Prof. Kruger, please? I hope you don't mind me pulling you in. Guy, I wanted you to highlight this, you know, this, let's call it a best practice or an example from South Africa, because I really think it's time that we start having this discussion here in Namibia. if I take, and we always do that, this is what we do traditionally, we always take our reference from the Windhoek Declaration, the 1991 Windhoek Declaration, because even in the 1991 Windhoek Declaration, I think it's point 16, that makes very specific reference to the need to support the viability or ensure the viability of independent media. In 1991, independent media was, and its viability and its ability to operate in Southern Africa was really at question. So there was a real need and acknowledgement to support independent media. And this then was again reinforced more specifically now, post, 30 years later, and under different circumstances, but the viability issue remains. Frans, you have written extensively about this, and you were quite involved in a similar process in Sierra Leone, where there is a partnership between media and government. Can you give us some insight into how that is working? Is it a model that is viable? And what can we as a country, Namibia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, as countries learn from that?
Thanks, Zoe. You caught me a little unawares, but thank you. It's great to be here, by the way, in Windhoek for all sorts of reasons. But let's not overstate my involvement in the Sierra Leone initiative. I spoke at a conference, and I don't really know much about what's happened since. But I certainly think that there is a lot of interest. There's a lot of ferment and activity around funds. And as I think Guy said, funds are one mechanism for viability. There are several others. But there are some crucial questions to ask about funds, I think. Firstly, where does the money come from, right? Is it government money? In Argentina, they have a model where the money comes through levies on telecoms operators. And I think that's quite an interesting approach. Secondly, I mean, what is the architecture of those funds to make sure that they are independent, that they really do support independent media? And thirdly, what is the sort of philosophy and the disbursement approach? I mean, a fundamental question is, are you giving out money on an ongoing basis forever and ever? It happens in the Nordic countries, right? There is a standard money that, there are standard grants that go out every year to media that meet certain requirements. And in a sense, that's realistic, right? This business crisis is not going to disappear very easily. Or do you do it on a project basis, on the assumption, and that's the MDDA's approach in South Africa, you're assuming things will be all right in a little while. And I'm not sure they are. But nevertheless, of course, you want, as Guy, I think, I liked his comment that you've got to transform the media for viability themselves. And what that for me means is to identify a number of different revenue streams, one of which can be funds, as long as they can keep up the, can keep working, basically, can keep putting money into media economies. But those are just some of the things I think we have to ask, and I think countries that are thinking of funds need to think about these things. Where does the money come from? How is it dispersed? What's the philosophy behind it, and what's the architecture? But there's a lot to be said, which I'm sure we'll explore as the day goes on.
Yeah, I agree. And importantly, whilst receiving subsidies or grants from whichever source, the independence of the media must be ensured at all times. Guy, I know that we're running out of time, but I have to ask this question because everyone wants to park the blame at the door of big internet companies, big tech, for this dwang that the media finds itself in. And I'm mindful of the fact, for example, in South Africa, yes, you can negotiate with Meta, with Google, etc., etc. They've got offices there. You can actually walk in there and have a sit down and discuss things with them. As far as I know, Meta has 2 offices in Africa, in South Africa and in Nigeria. And they have a particular interest in those economies because these are large economies, many clicks, many people. A country like Namibia with a population of plus 2.5 million is generally insignificant in this space. I've got this idea, and this is my little thing. I believe that an avenue for African countries, which is not being sufficiently pursued, is the potential being created by the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which would make Africa the biggest trade bloc in the world. What do you think about that idea? I mean, we're throwing ideas around, this is the space for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons why big tech is so successful because of scale.
Mhm.
You know, they have global scale. They have basically one product, one service, and they roll it out globally. And that means, you know, basically your production costs are fairly limited. As we know, they don't spend as they should do. They should be spending money on moderation and content control in local languages. We know they don't do that because it costs them money. And they only do it if they're forced to do it, like the EU may force them now. But, you know, their secret is scale. You know, they have a real global market. One of the problems that the advantage they have of scale is not just production costs, but they get data. Okay? So everybody here, you think you're searching Google, but Google's searching you. And you think you're networking through Facebook, but actually Facebook is pulling you into its network. And you think that you're watching TikTok, but TikTok is watching you. So they get all your data and they use this data to really pinpoint what content they're going to give you. And then they also going to, so they try and keep you addicted and so on. And what they find in many countries, the more emotional the content, the more aggressive the content, the more people will follow it. So as the media want to get into that business, even at small scale or big scale, I think Tangeni there, I don't think he's interested in using the data of Namibia's online audience to like really, you know, give them the worst of the worst kind of content. No, I don't think so. But here he is, he's got a media house, and although he's not on the business side, the guy's got to think business-wise. Could he think business-wise with African free trade area? In other words, to what extent could the Namibian become much more involved in a pan-African market rather than a Namibian market? Could there be scale? Now, you know, Zoe, as well as I do, that there have been attempts to create regional funds back in the days of SAMDEF. There have been attempts to create regional news agencies, and they didn't work for a range of reasons. It doesn't mean that they don't work per se. We have to re-look at them in the new possibilities and new abilities that we have, new insights we have. But maybe there's some way of developing scale, capitalizing on this, because really a lot of work goes into producing content for the Namibian. Like, how can it be repurposed both within Namibia and podcasts and everything else, but also how could it actually be used on a global scale? I mean, people here in Namibia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, we're not short of talent in this part of the world. I mean, South Africa, the biggest cultural export is Trevor Noah, or Jerusalem. But Jerusalem is entertainment. It's great. But Trevor Noah, this guy, he's the photojournalist. I mean, he asks really good questions. He makes really informed comments. He's taken down Kanye. He's taken down Elon Musk and so on. Anyway, he's excellent. He's a South African export. Okay, he doesn't bring much money into the country, I suppose. But nevertheless, so what have you got? What have we got here in terms of media people who can actually do storytelling that's going to kind of become viral, and not viral through the exploitation and manipulation of data, but because the content is so good. And I don't see why not. I mean, there's just like amazing stories that are happening in this part of the world. So It could be a way, but then you
Yeah.
also have the advocacy thing. Let me just say one last comment here, that this African free trade area, like a lot of, unfortunately, African policies, great on paper, there's no implementation. So you need media to like be pushing. We need implementation, what's happening, holding the politicians to account. In the meantime, as you know, especially in my country, politicians are busy seeing what is in it for their own pockets. And then you come back, so how does a weak media keep the political people to account for all the initiatives? But I just wanted to pick up on what Frans said, that this is a thing that SANEF may consider. In South Africa, in the Department of Justice, you have a fund called CARA, C-A-R-A, CARA. Anybody guess what that stands for? CARA. Corrupt Assets Recovery Account. This account had 200 million in it, I think, if I remember correctly. 200 million rand, which is small in terms of the amount that gets stolen, but it's at least something. 200 million rand could go a long way towards supporting investigative journalism in South Africa. If there was a system that of that money that is recovered, and it's recovered because of journalism largely, if some of that money, 50% or 20% or 10% was put in a fund that's independently governed to support investigative journalism, it's a way of like, you know, public gets money back, but the money can then go into, you know, keeping government to account as well. So we need those kinds of mechanisms that are not available for capture, because we know captures like all over the world. Captures, South Africa knows it very, very well, capture. But I think if we could have this whole ecosystem of mechanisms that can support journalism. Journalism can support policy implementation, including regional policy implementation. And then journalism can also find ways to build and expand and be useful and informative to people in the whole region, let alone the whole continent. I mean, then we're talking.
A lot more thinking needs to be done.
Well, this is where journalism education, I mean, Zoe, you asking me the question, but you are, I would, if I can turn the tables here. I mean, what's, journalism education and training. This is like, it's not just technical, it's thinking also. So what should be happening in these courses for working journalists? What should be happening with the, at the technicons, at the universities, in the short programs that are being offered by?
Well, we did a skills needs assessment, and I'm going to chat about that a little later. But Tangeni, I'm very happy to see you. Tangeni is the person to answer that question because he's in the newsroom. He knows what the industry needs, and he's better placed to answer that question. Tangeni, do you want to take this one?
No. I could just say well dodged. Sorry.
Good morning. Well, sure. I think we need to repurpose ourselves when you talk about what skills are needed. For instance, one thing for sure is there's no more just print journalism or radio journalism or television journalism or digital journalism, whatever now the strands they are. We have to operate in a multi-platform, multimedia environment. So at the very basics, one reporter should know how to captivate and become relevant to an audience or audiences across different platforms. So that for me is the most crucial part. To start with, it's a base.
Thanks, Tangeni. I mean, he is reinforcing what we also say that you need multi-skilled journalists who are able to work in a multi-platform environment. The other thing, and I think this is, just something that landed with us in the context of COVID. The fact that journalism has to be more community focused, community oriented, and responsive to the needs of people. Namibians, first and foremost, want to see themselves in the newspapers. They want to see themselves reflected in the media that they consume. And journalists who have that engagement, as Franz said in his presentation earlier today, are the brokers of engagement and community relations. I think journalists now are required to play that role, be the spokespersons of communities, be the campaigners for social justice. And that is part of, I think, the recipe for a more sustainable and viable media. I hope I've answered your question. No, I answered a little bit, and thank you, Tangeni, for your contribution. We don't have much time left. If there are any questions, I think maybe we can take one or two.
Actually exhausted the time for this session, but I think we can see if there are any contributions, either in the room or virtually. Contributions, questions. Okay, virtually. Okay, I think we got a lot of insights from the discussion that we just had, the actual interview. I think, thank you, Prof. Berger, thanks Zoe, thank you to Professor Kruger for also contributing, as well as Tangeni. A lot of the issues that came up speak to the broader theme of the conference. It spoke on digital disruptions. Professor Berger was actually telling us about the case in South Africa where advertising has dropped, and the vast majority of the population is on Facebook. So looking at advertising along there. We also heard that, do we have the ability to do viability? I think that's a very pertinent question. But I think from my end, the takeaway is that there's multiple ideas around this issue. I think some of it is already encapsulated, as indicated within the Windhoek Plus 30 declaration, but also the way forward, the future of journalism education in Southern Africa.
Younger years, I was editor of a newspaper in Cape Town called The South, an anti-apartheid newspaper. And there were several others at the time, and none of them survived because we were thinking too much like journalists and exclusively journalists, and we weren't thinking about the viability question. Very sad. But here you had, in Namibia, a success story. You had the Namibian that showed the world you can start a publication with some support capital, but then it becomes viable. That was like really exceptional in the region, I must tell you. So the question to you guys now, especially in Namibia, is with the new challenges for viability, are you going to set the example? Are you going to be a trendsetter, like Mr. Ngitila said? Because I think Namibia can do it. You've got a lot of interest and talent and experience here. You've got press freedom. You don't have to fight like that. So you're not like the poor colleagues in Zimbabwe. We have to do two things. Here, you can do one thing. You can really focus on this. And you also have here in Namibia a man called Peter Denk. I think you know who he is. I don't have to. He is the representative of Namibia at this IPDC committee that you saw the video of in the beginning at UNESCO. So whatever you do here, he can report that internationally. So, but you've got to be doing interesting things, and he can take those stories there, and he can bring back stories. So I would really suggest you try and institutionalize discussions here. Maybe once every 4 months, 5 months, the editors Bring in the advertisers, really important. Bring in some tech people, because you can also have tech, not just big tech, you can have local tech, and you've got tech people here also. Just to tell you very quickly, in South Africa, there's a company, when I was looking at statistics, what's the penetration of WhatsApp, Facebook, and so on, there's a company called Moyo app. It's got 8 million people. This is a local direct messaging app funded by advertising. WhatsApp doesn't have direct advertising. So you've got some tech possibilities here. You just need to bring together these different constituencies and say, okay, what can be done? Government, with their side, they've got a lot to contribute. Funding, funds, environment, tax, etc., etc. The trainers, the Tangenis, Namibia Media Trust. You've got stakeholders here, you've got a link to IPDC. So really, Namibia, if you don't rise to the occasion here, you'll miss your vocation. And your vocation is to build the aptitude and the capacity and everything else that's needed for viability. So there it is, viability, and you've got the ability. You just have to do it.
Thanks, Guy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
So,
kusokoneza kwa makina a intaneti, kukonza maphunziro othandizira kukweza bizinesi za nyumba zofalitsa mauthenga.